Witchfinder Phenomenal, filming a hauntology of queer mixed race identity in crisis in a world in crisis. Hi, my name is Maria Rosamojo. I'm a multimedia outsider artist completing my master's project, an autoethnographic film Witchfinder Phenomenal, at the London School of Art, Architecture and Design. Today, as you are watching this in my future from our shared past, I'm presenting a hauntological re-evaluation of post-colonial creative and ethnographic practice from the perspective of a British black mixed-race queer woman with physical and mental health challenges. I'll be charting some of the embodied experiences that occurred as I researched and made my film in 2020 during a world health crisis, lockdown, and the Black Lives Matter movement. New and old discourses, specifically around race, are only now being more widely understood. As Black and minority voices share their personal narratives, they are being met now with more empathy and activist support from white allies who are waking up to their own privilege. This in turn produces revolutionary discourses that are emphatically calling for a re-evaluation of global state-controlled practices. I hope to join the existing narratives of artists in similar positions to myself by demonstrating that the artist as other is so used to managing crisis, their experiences' voices are invaluable in a world in crisis. Due to social distancing, I filmed and directed my actors Maisie and Ella Stewart Holland via Zoom. I also queerly resisted patriarchal colonial practices by making them co-producers of the film, so that while I still attain awful rights, they will have an equal and empowered voice in future decisions on how the film is represented and shared. I believe that the ethnographic filmmaker's only way to be truly ethical is to predict and take full responsibility on behalf of participants for any potential risks of exploitation. The Witchfinder Phenomenal narrates the story from the past, present and future to reveal how traumatised 12-year-old protagonist Aurora Mojo, played by Maisie Stewart Holland, attempts to free herself from a nightmare world of racism, abuse and disassociation. All the while, her nemesis, the white privileged hell witch Beelzebeth, played by Ella Stewart Holland, torments and tries to silence her. But Aurora finds solace when a fairy horse mother, Astataria, arrives and introduces her to a world of rebellious witches from history and myth who sing her their tales. In 2020, adversity urgently queered resistance to enable political discourse. These discourses, specifically around race, ethics and earth consciousness, called for a re-evaluation of worldwide systems that are still entrenched in colonial hierarchical structures. The artist subject as other is ironically privileged in working with limited resources to make art accessible due to their own experiences of inaccessibility. In this instance, I believe the practice of culturally embodied performative discourses can and do challenge patriarchally prescribed academic frameworks so that marginalised voices in art, academia and ethnographic studies can be harvested to produce fairly executed ethical guidelines in the future. Curiously, before the pandemic, my aim in making my film was to create an online theatre experience that I could also show on real life stages, as I was worried about whether I would be able to commit to a full live hour-long performance anymore because of my disabilities. I thought that by making the film, I could play parts of the film on a live stage along with a live performance. When Theatre Life returns, I want to experiment by bringing other minority performers to play some of the witches on stage. But until then, I feel blessed that online technologies are able to keep us entertained and provide a platform for disabled people like myself. Witchfinder Phenomenal is a darkly comic fairy tale based on my real lived experiences growing up in 80s Harlesden with my Spanish mum and my dad from Barbados. I performed a hauntological inquiry into my identity to evaluate how I evolved from a shy, troubled child into an empowered individual within a society where I was made to feel like a proverbial cuckoo. I posited that society's need for patriarchal logic, order and absolute obedience in all areas from schools, health, care to government conjures up witchfinder spectres that perpetually haunt disempowered subjects who do not fit within normative realms. I employed a framework that utilises the concepts of hauntology, the divine feminine, and a spatload of theoretical research. These illuminated how the presence of both post-colonial and witchfinder spectres operate to silence and destabilise other subjects. I placed myself and rebellious women deemed to be witches in history and myth in complex but empowering positions within my film so I could convey representational stories. As I began storytelling and performing, I drew out witch-finding spectres by practicing what Jacques Derrida described as the art of allowing ghosts to come back. My research for the film explores how witch-finding spectres haunt memories of past experience and also from the imagined futures triggered by those same memories. Derrida further suggested that instead of remaining a subject of haunting, we should instead converse with our spectres to learn from them. Unable to move beyond a perpetual and temporal time loop of persecution, what better way to dance a spectre out with one's own autonomic agency? Witchfinder Phenomenal is the result of an often noisy, humorous, and terrifying seance held with my spectres as we determined how to agree a truce within a society that marginalises the other and marks them out to be witches. Many of the art and design method models required for academic use are constructed on principles that are monopolised by a left-brained, male-centric academic bias. But many diverse working artists' brains, their cognitive perceptions, cultural and ethno-linguistics are not represented in those models. We can't be inclusive while relying on non-inclusive systems, so it's good to make your own, and made my model as an intuitive feminist counteraction to patriarchal thought processes. The vivid creatrix expression model is based on triple goddess symbolism and points to themes, signifiers, and serendipitous occurrences that occurred in my inner and outer worlds while making the film. In this way, I could externalise the internalised in my film and haunt back the society that has haunted me and thwarted my identity as it formed. It's user-friendly as I could simply channel the power of freeze, my thoughts, embodied action, and ghost muse. My model identifies the main interactive components as thoughts, as witch within, embodied actions as witchcrafting, and the ghost muse as witch manifestation. It's still a work in progress. In the act of creating, my thoughts reflected on having hardly any visible role models to identify with growing up mixed race at a time where there were few, if any. When I couldn't fit in or be accepted into the Western society's construct of the white idol of femininity or the angry yet stoic black daughter of slaves, I began to dissociate, to escape, and this led to self-harm. Mixed race children's mental health is still failing to be addressed in modern Britain, despite statistics showing them to be the fastest growing ethnicity. In my film, I needed to visually evidence the feeling of alienation my protagonist, 12-year-old Rosamojo, played by Maisie, experiences without condemning her to victimhood or to solely identify her as the tragic mulatto. The tragic mulatto is a trope in stories that depicts the mixed-race individual as a desperate, sad figure who doesn't belong and is rejected by white and black worlds. The tragic mulatto could be argued to be a mythical stereotype, but it was easy for me to identify with because the racist abuse I endured from white people was also tempered from the black community. I can now see why and how my mind, young then, hopelessly and sometimes melodramatically, identified with suicidal heroines in film and literature such as Kathy from Wuthering Heights, The Tragedy of Marilyn Monroe, and obviously the tragic mulatto in roles such as Carmen and in Imitation of Life. I now view this identity crisis as a state of metamorphic unrest. At age 9, I attempted suicide because I didn't want to wake up the next day. My saving grace was that I would also find relief in empowering relatedness, realising I could metaphysically and archaically identify with the power of the witch in the rebel posters on my wall, like Kate Bush, Pauline Black, Susie Sue, Boy George, to name a few. The witch had a superpower of flight and elusiveness, and more importantly, she could turn her enemies into toads. These thoughts would take me to embodied action. the crafting of my thoughts with my physical hands in editing and my voice in writing and performance. Maisie, who plays Aurora Mojo, is based on myself coming of age. I had first explained to Maisie that I had been a shy, troubled, withdrawn child whose saving grace was my ability to laugh at things. I also informed her that while I had a wisdom about me, I was also much more innocent than kids today and had no mobile phone or internet. Maisie reminded me a lot of myself at her age, as she was funny, shy, but she masked it better. She was more confident, forthcoming, and eloquent, as well as being fiercely intelligent. She told me how she had wanted to play Mary in a Christmas play when she was younger, and how she'd also wanted to act as Annie in the musical, but they were white, and she was now choosing to be an actress so she could prove she too could inhabit these roles. While I'm thankful that mixed race kids are the fastest growing in the UK today, it also has its challenge within a hostile environment. But what I admired in Maisie was her cheeky and bold defiance to her limited choices and conditions. She certainly wasn't going to be left behind or become a victim of circumstance. In fact, I had a vision of Maisie at 5 years old getting to play Mary in the Christmas school play, Mary, the resistance fighter of Bethlehem. Maisie's character, Aurora, needed to be portrayed as vulnerable and haunted to show the reality, but I also wanted to key in a redemptive element by giving her a witch-like power. I referred back to my storyboard where Aurora is having a nightmare of one of the real events that happened to me around the same age. I had previously written an account of being pushed towards a waltzer by a skinhead in a fairground incident as part of a BBC drama screenplay submission that earned me a place in the top 4% of promising writers in 2018. In 2020, I now had the opportunity to flesh it out on film. The storyboard enabled me to think how to vividly, visually, and symbolically add elements to the film. In this way, I could experiment with animating the images to give me an idea of how the final film would orchestrate it. To depict the skinheads, I found a 1980s black and white image online of Nazi skinheads at a march with the British Union Jack raised behind them. It was uncanny and it gave me shivers. So I located its photographer, Chris Steele Perkins, and asked his permission to use his image in the film, and he gladly agreed. During editing, I encountered the third dynamic spell in my model, the Ghost Muse, many times. An edit that went wrong would surprisingly look perfect for a scene. I'd find a black girl magic earring on the pavement. I'd find an actual fairground waltzer during COVID-19. The Ghost Muse sporadically conjures, binds, and even hexed my concoctions, but all to formulate a unique kind of curios which could potentially charm the onlooker. My goal was to create moments in a film that looked fantastical but expressed the true reality of a lived experience. Researching my queer mixed identity was literally bringing back the ghosts of my past, present and future selves. While I had released the inner child me at the fairground in the dream sequence, my inner child was cheering me on supportively. She could be free as she flew high on her broom. Uncannily, Jacques Derrida's notion that ghosts are part of our future is more poignant than ever, having survived 2020. The surreal magnitude of COVID-19, lockdown, the brutal murder of George Floyd, and my diagnosis of diabetes and hyperthyroidism occurred in parallel during the completion of my master's final project of development and filmmaking. My Bayesian father died 3 years ago from diabetes, and his ghost is alive in me, not only in the sugars, but also in his insights about opium magic and social injustice. But when faced with fewer choices, our struggles are stored as an intelligent source of knowledge for experience in the brain, making you more creative at problem solving because you are an expert at trying to cope. You are an expert at trying to cope. The tragic spectacle of George Floyd's death was a painful example of the cost of exposing the truth of what it is to live with the ghost of a rope around your neck. While attempting to unveil the stigma of what it is to be another subject, I worked through themes of collective trauma shared by many. In the same way, lockdown has given the more privileged among us a mindful experience of what it may feel like to be isolated and locked out of society. COVID-19 has severely affected many of us across the world. 3 of my best friends each lost a parent to it. Their grief is severely thwarted in lockdown, where the human contact of a hug is illegal because of the disease's contagion. Aya, Aya A. Coley, in her 2019 book Post-Colonial Hauntologies, speaks of how post-colonial silences surround African discourse in Western culture. She argues that African discourse is so entrenched in colonialist white privilege, systematically racist systems, that it is hard to think of her own black embodied female body agency outside colonial structuralism. When I began my research, I wanted to speak in my own culturally embodied and representative voice to combat the dominating and colonially biased systems in academia, but it's hard to see the wood for the trees, or rather, your autonomy for the coercively prescribed ruling classes. Part of the research, I keep smiling, but I don't really want to smile all the time, but I have to keep going. Part of my research was to spend time in nature, specifically nearby woods, they make me smile, where I would tune into the trees and ether to help me envision my next move. I called the woods the Forest of Fairy, as it was so magical and life-affirming to be there, and I am a bit of a fairy as well. One tutor had thought I had said I spent my time in the Forest of Fairy, and in fact I had, because the forest gave me the space to get to the grips with existing theories and develop my own in a way that nurtured me. In academia, I am in a wood where the earth is rich and it could help me grow, only if the colonial trees weren't standing in my way. Colonial trees are not normal trees, no. These trees are man-made from the finest mahogany by slaves. Any movement past these trees is disallowed, and instead of providing oxygen, their purpose is to suffocate you until you're pushed back out of the educated classes to where you belong. In these rigid structures of oppression, there is no room to breathe freely. This is not to say that my university tutors weren't encouraging or empathic. They mostly were, but how could they advise on what they couldn't possibly know when the system actively encourages post-colonial silences? In a multicultural university in the middle of London, there was only one black tutor. I tried hard for a year, and eventually he was informed and was able to give me feedback on my work. Imagine having to fight for someone representative to read your work in an academic system that is meant to be progressive. Thankfully, the university did provide me with a black mentor, Shirley, who was beyond supportive and empowered me through it all. I refused to suffer post-colonial silences. Those mahogany trees are made of sweat, tears, and ghost slaves that need to be heard. A solution for the lack of black tutors, aside from hiring more, would be to make it essential for universities to outsource companies who can train individuals to potentially work as representative tutors when needed. This could be government funded, but I'm a little concerned that the Lords of Parliament are too fond of mahogany. In 2020, while in crisis internally and externally, I was somehow able to make the invisible visible by creating Witchfinder Phenomenal and allowing the unheard to be heard through my personal and imagined narratives through performance. I am proud to identify as a black queer budget outsider artist, as ultimately it leads to more creative and analytical thinking when trying to overcome arising problems. In 2021, I'm battle weary but emboldened, because in making my film Against the Odds, I have been able to occupy previously disallowed space by looking through the mirror phenomenally to reclaim my own reflection back, my autonomy, within the safe space of ancient, ancestral, matriarchal folk magic and witch power. Bell Hooks in 1994 imagines a world with no white dominance and believes many privileged people also yearn for this type of revolutionary change, even though it might mean giving up their privilege. Yearning is a state we all share, according to Hooks. In capturing a hauntology of identity, I yearn to capture a state of empowerment that is born from a yearning to belong, that acknowledges white privilege but also transcends the term when loving white allies who support us. Kate Bush's music cradles me as my mother's arms do as a baby. I believe belonging is a state we all yearn for, but for some it's a ghostly reminder that they don't belong. Is it your turn to shine? Don't think I'll ever pray to rosary with honest intent. But when I think of the friend you were to me, I can't help feel negligent. Now you're with the crows, nose down, greedy birds and
Occupy the space that allows you to breathe freely.